Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and how the spice must flow. At a corner table by the fire are three people. One of them is unsure about drinking this glowing blue stuff. He doesn't care if it will expand his mind. He already saw where they got it from. And that's me, Matthew Mellema. And welcome to Believe to See. We are a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. So, Dune. Well, as you're listening to it, I'm guessing it's probably newly available for stream. Maybe it's on Max. I don't know. I don't get Max. I'm not cool enough. I'm just a straightforward Netflix guy. But anyway, Dune, it's been in the zeitgeist recently. My dad's a big fan of it. My brother's a fan. A bunch of my friends are fans. And I will be honest, I've tried on multiple occasions to read the book. And each time I barely got into a couple chapters before I go like, the frick are they talking about? Why is he putting his hand in the box? And what? There's space witches? What? Wait, why is the hero named Paul? Wait, the intergalactic space witch is Jessica? Duncan, Idaho? What? So anyway, I have not been able to get as into it as I feel like I should, right? You know, like you go to you listen to some songs, you read some books that everyone likes, and it's like, okay, maybe I'm the problem here. So maybe I'm the problem, and maybe some of you all listening feel this same way. You're like, okay, Dune, okay, sand and stuff, right? You know, Timothée Chalamet, you know, glaring off into the distance with sand. But you don't get it. So here's what we're going to do. I brought in two people who I believe get it, and they will be convincing me why I should just learn to love the Dune. So here we go. Let's bring in the first one, the Muad'Dib Napata himself, Brian Brown.
Oh my gosh. Well, despite that intro, I must say, any conversation that begins with "Matt's the problem," I'm in.
Thank you. Would you like to drink this glowing blue Gatorade? I got it from a worm out back.
Will I know more deeply that Matt's the problem?
Yeah, probably. And the other one, Peter Houk. Peter, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Listeners, you may have heard Peter, you know, walking around quietly in the background. Mandy will reference him sometimes, but here he is, out from the shadows, just ready. He's like jumping out of the sand dune and ready to attack us all with those knives with the glowing, like, vibrating armor and stuff. It'll be wonderful. Okay, so here we go. Dune. Staring off into the distance. You see, this is Denis... The director, I thought it was Denis Villeneuve. We talked about this in the green room. But apparently he's French-Canadian. It's like Denis Villeneuve. I'm staring off into the distance like I'm in a Denis Villeneuve shot. Picture me contemplating fate and, you know, giant worms. Brian, Dune, what do you think of it?
So I don't go too terribly far back with it. The first time I read it was in the fall of 2021, so relatively recently. And I have to admit, first of all, that I was stuck in a 10-day quarantine in Spain at the time. So my tolerance tolerance for boredom was high.
I mean, it reminds me of watching the first Dune movie. But anyway,
it
continue.
may very well be that it's not as good as I remembered, but I did flip through it a couple more times as the movies came out. And I'm not quite the world building nerd that you are and that some other people who've been on the show are, but I don't know. I'm used to reading sci-fi that's about, hey, look, in the future, technology will be different. How will we live? And this was fun because it was, technology kind of comes and goes. Human nature is a thing. How will that play out? And just from a sheer kind of nerddom standpoint, that really caught my interest early.
Okay. So there's one thing. Being stuck in quarantine is a way to trick your brain, Stockholm Syndrome-like, into thinking that it's good. All right, Peter,
Yes.
let's get yours. Sounds like you have more background with this than we do. So tell us Dune.
Yeah, I'll give you a little context that is different. That the book was published the year that I was born.
Oh.
So I
you are
read
one
it.
Dune year.
So I read it
You
when
read
I
it
was
on the
in
first
high
day,
school.
right? Oh, okay.
No, not quite.
His father reads it to him in his little bassinet. And then the Leo Atreides took his concubine Jessica.
So it had been a while since I had read it, and I loved it as a kid because of the world building being so different than anything I'd read, and because of the technology. There are some people like Brian, you're kind of saying it's technology light maybe, but I would say it's more different technology than anything we've ever seen, and the space travel, which they really didn't play with much in the movies.
Mm-hmm.
So I reread it again knowing the movies were coming out, because I hated the first one in 1984, I think it was. And so appreciate it still. I do think it's kind of funny as an engineer, knowing what I know about technology these days, that there's no way that you could make an ornithopter actually work. But
I picture you and Mandy in the theater, and you like poking Mandy's ribs. You know, that ornithopter is not practical at all.
No, it's not. But it's cool. But I do appreciate what Brian said about human nature, that there's, I think, a theme of moral dilemma in the series of how do people make choices, and whether it's for selfish reasons and gains, or whether it's for sacrificial, that sort of thing. So.
Okay, so with that in mind, let me say to the listeners here, because we probably have a mix of listeners, some who are familiar with Dune, read the books, watched the movie, some who aren't, and maybe are considering it. So let me just say, I'm going to give lots of spoilers here. So if that matters to you, keep that in mind. But let me say that I don't think it should matter that much for a couple reasons. One, the way these movies are set up, there's such an element of fate and destiny where you kind of know what's going to happen the whole time. Like, we know that House Atreides is going to get, betrayed on Arrakis a few minutes into the movie, right? We know Paul's going to become the God King Emperor pretty soon in movie 2. We all know that. It's telegraphed, okay? Also, in preparation for seeing Dune Part 2, I did a deep dive on Wikipedia and on YouTube to try to understand the world of Dune. Because when I first saw the movie, I had no clue what was going on. So I know what's going on now with the world. I can't unsee some of the things that I've read. But so I do not feel that impacted my enjoyment of the film at all. So all that is to say, if you haven't seen the movie, you're planning on it, turn this off if you want, but I think you'll be fine. Okay, so let's start with the world, because I think the world is interesting, but also, what? Okay, so that takes place tens of thousands of years in the future. I think like 20,000 years in the future.
10,000.
Really?
Yeah.
See, this is why we thank you. Okay.
Numbers matter, Matt.
Yes, they do. So by this time, humanity has conquered lots of different planets. And for some reason, they've decided computers are bad. But what's not bad is severely mind-altering drugs that change your perception of reality and turn you into a superhero. Again, iPhone bad. Melange, the spice, super good, okay? So no computers. That's interesting for the world. We can talk about it more. No computers because of something called the Butlerian Jihad. Brian, you're looking at me, you're like, oh, I didn't know Matt was so well-versed in the lore of Dune. Now, if you're thinking like I did, that this was Judith Butler, the gender studies professor, yes, she would declare jihad, but this is not hers. This is against computers. So no computers, So instead of computers, we've turned people into computers by giving them this spice. And the spice, called melange, is only on this desert planet of Arrakis. The only things on Arrakis are a bunch of people called the Fremen and giant worms, okay? And you need to control this planet to get the spice, because he who controls Arrakis controls the spice, and he who controls the spice controls the universe.
But not just because people are addicted to a spice. We should be clear.
Right.
Wait, isn't it just because people are addicted to a spice?
Space travel.
Well, yeah, okay, yeah. So people are addicted to the spice, and it like makes you live longer, and it opens up your brain and stuff.
And that's why the movie, maybe that's the fault I have with the movie, is they didn't spend enough time with the space travel part of it, because that's a big part of why the spice is so important.
Because the space pilots like sit in vats of the spice, turning them into like weird misshapen freaks of the galaxy, but it enables them to fold space on itself and travel.
Right.
Okay, so that's where we are. Okay.
Just to be clear, we didn't volunteer for this. Our wives volunteered us
because I was
listen to this.
I was doing these lectures. I was giving these rants to them. They're like, I can't deal with this. Peter and Brian will do it.
Both Christina and Mandy were like, no, I'm out.
Okay, so
I know someone who could handle this.
So here's the premises, right? The no computers because of the Judith Butler jihad, and then the spice that turns you into, the space traveling superheroes. How do we feel about these decisions in terms of the world building? Do you find those effective? Do you find them compelling, Brian?
I mean, as the newer convert, I guess, to the series, I mean, one thing I appreciated about it is that with both a lot of sci-fi movies and a lot of dystopia movies, there's sort of this pretty universal, I would say, assumption that technology is this tidal wave, that like there's really never going to be a point in human history where we reject the next technology. And so I actually thought it was interesting that the world you encounter in the original Dune story is one where actually something different has happened. It's not that technology didn't keep advancing, it's that sentient life had to make different decisions that weren't just, it happened. And it's always going to happen. So you encounter, I mean, if you've seen the movie, you've seen this. I mean, they're using knives. They're using what for 10,000 years in the future. You wouldn't assume that's going to be the future, but then
they have those shields in battle that are electronic.
That part I actually thought was cool. I will say I like this sort of, you can tell Frank Hebert, the author of the original Dune book, he's like, okay, I want a world, computers would just make it lame, right? Just like Mandy hates her characters having cell phones, so all the books take place in the 70s, right? It's like, Herbert's like, computers and sci-fi is stupid, so they don't have it. Instead, they teach people to become computers through like LSD. Okay, so we have that, and also, guns are stupid. I'd rather have them fight with swords. I'm all on board with that, so they have this thing where basically they have shielding that covers your body, and if something hits you at a high rate of speed, it just bounces off. So the only way to get through it is to move slowly. So bullets wouldn't do any good, but really, really dope knives from like giant worms would do it. Right. I'm on board for that part. Okay, Peter, your thoughts about the world building?
So I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but
dive deep into the lore.
Frank Hebert was actually inspired by Lawrence of Arabia. And that's where the inspiration of the desert planet and the sword fighting and the sort of backwards culture, but some advanced technology. He kind of mixed it together. So, some people say he copied Lawrence of Arabia, which I think is kind of unfair. That he was just inspired by it, just like anybody else is inspired by something that. They write their book about. In
that, I think there's some important aspects there for the themes, which we'll get to in just a bit, but also in terms of the world building, like you said, that definitely has that vibe, right? You picture like the big sand dunes in Arabia, this sort of mysterious figure who comes, gathers the locals and all this stuff. So it definitely has that vibe to it. While we're on the topic, let's talk about mind-altering drugs, as we so often do on Believe to See. What's your take on that, Peter? Because like it came out, it's 68 into the 70s. That was very in vogue in that time. Right. Should I look for more important themes beyond that, or was he just like, hey, let's alter our perceptions?
I don't, that's a good question, because I don't know if he meant it for that purpose. I mean, in terms of, are we talking about the spice?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think he was more using spice as a analogy of oil in the time that he was writing. It's in the time of OPEC and the oil crises and the, who's going to be in control of oil. And I think that's where he was going with. Now you've got a bunch of planets that all want control of this one resource commodity because it's so important. So,
okay, now that is important for the world building too. So there's the purpose that the spice serves, and again, you kind of reverse engineer this, where you see the destination Frank Herbert wants to get to, right? He wants swords and knives, doesn't want those computers, and he wants all the parallels for like Lawrence of Arabia, oil, and all of that stuff. So that all makes sense as far as it goes. Brian, melange, yes or no?
Well, I want to push back a little bit on your framing of I want these old things, so I'll set a story 10,000 years in the future, so oops, I better get around that somehow. I think there's a fair degree of intentionality there, and the spice is actually almost more of a neutral player as it plays out in that respect. Because I mean, you have the premise, the reason that there are some aspects of this far in the future that we think of as technologically not advanced Herbert. I read a quote from Herbert that I don't remember when he said it, but I mean he just very firmly believed that superheroes were terrible for mankind, and so he builds this universe where, to a large extent, that's a given. Right? They've kind of pushed back against AI. They've pushed back against different elements of technology that essentially allow superheroes to develop, essentially people to be too dangerous. And then, so it's the technological foundation of the story on some level, is that superheroes are terrible for mankind. And then as the story plays out, it's wrestling with, but there's tech and magic are not the only ways to become a superhero. Political power, getting the masses this excited about you is another way to become a superhero. And that doesn't change with technology.
Yeah, and maybe I'm just being persnickety about this, because it's just, I lose a little bit of suspended disbelief here by just saying no computers in the future, right? And they try again, they dress it up with the Butlerian jihad, and like it's just really ingrained to people like, no thinking machines. But then it's like, okay, if you're on a planet that's being oppressed by all these superhuman melange people, don't you think you'd maybe be inspired to finesse some of your preconceptions to develop the super powerful AI? I don't know. It probably does. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for the broader story, but that part does bother me. Okay, so there it is with some of the world building stuff. Go ahead.
I would say, going with what Brian's saying, that it really is about human nature, and I think that might be why he went away from the computers and any artificial intelligent kind of stuff, that he wanted to bring out the who we are as humanity, and maybe he felt computers would get in the way of that. I don't know.
No,
I mean, from chronologically speaking, I mean, Star Trek is the same time period, and he's kind of looking at, okay, well, Star Trek is also doing really interesting moral storytelling, but a lot of people are watching it because it's future computers and spaceships. And he's like, okay, I don't want to deal with any of that. You're getting distracted from what really matters. So I'm going to tell that story.
Right.
No, and I do think in terms of what he's trying to do with the story, the decision makes sense. I think I'm just being persnickety, okay? But just like the same part of my brain's like, why don't the scientists try to develop a synthetic melange? I feel like we could be doing this, right? I'd invest some resources in that rather than none of that matters. Okay, so now let's go through some of the core themes here. You all already touched on some of them, and I think the themes are interesting, but I feel like they're very easy to miss. Like, I felt like the first time I just sort of let the movies wash over me, I'm like, well, that was kind of weird. But when you think about it more, there might be some themes that come out. So Brian, what are some of the main themes that you noticed?
I mean, the corrupting effects of power, for sure. And I think when you see these sorts of epic movies, we're sort of used to encountering them as hero's journey stories, and it's not a hero's journey story.
That's true.
You know, you could debate, I suppose, whether it's the opposite of a hero's journey story or just not a hero's journey story. But I don't know. It's unusual to tell this story it has a protagonist, but he's really the good guy. Like, you have tragedies where he's definitely the good guy, but he fails. You definitely have sort of anti-hero types as well, but this is kind of interesting in that respect. So I really enjoy it, and the book is better in this respect because you can get in people's heads a lot more. And I miss the fancy state dinner scene in the movie because that was such a telling scene in the book. I don't know how you would have done it in the movie, but that's one thing that I really liked. You have this anti-hero's journey story about the corrupting effects of power that's not a tragedy per se, but also isn't just, Paul's a terrible person the whole way.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the key for me to... That's sort of the thing that picked the lock for me in a lot of ways. Because going into it, I assume, because this is the blueprint we're given in so many films, right? Like, this is the hero's journey, Paul's the hero, here he is, he's like doing his stuff. And then when you really get going with it, it's like, Paul dude's getting a little out of control here. Oh, that vengeance is a little over the top. Oh, he's nuking. Oh, okay. So that once I get it out of my head, like, okay, Paul's not really the hero. That does help a lot in knowing that was sort of one of Herbert's underlying themes here, right? It's like, don't trust your heroes. Don't put all of your eggs in the basket of the charismatic leader. Don't give all of your hopes and dreams into this one sort of avatar. That is a lot more interesting, and I'd be interested to see what they do with that if the series keeps going on in the film form. Peter, you can probably speak to what happened more in the books. That part is interesting, but also it kind of gets me to this weird stage because we're inclined to cheer for Paul, right? Because, he's the protagonist. He's the very special boy. The other side, they're clearly all a bunch of bonkers psychopaths. So we cheer for him, but it's like, it's sort of like the bad guys. It's not the good guys versus bad guys. It's the bad guys versus the good, also bad guys, right? Right, Peter? Like, is this how we should be viewing it?
Yeah. I mean, the Fremen aren't necessarily good as well. And I do agree that the corruption of power is definitely a theme. And that goes along with the politics of everything too, with who's going to control the spice and how the emperor is manipulating everything for his purposes. And but then I do like I brought this up before, that I do think there's a theme of moral dilemma.
Yeah,
people are coming to these points where they have to make decisions. And do they make the right decision? Do they make the wrong decision? And is it for selfish reasons? Is it for sacrificial reasons? That sort of thing.
What did you think about the book versus the movie in that respect? Because the book, I don't know. I feel like Villeneuve as a director, had an interesting challenge on his hands because he's making the second movie. He probably doesn't know at that point if he's going to get a third movie, and he's not planning on making 10 movies.
Right.
So how do I end this story in a way that's sort of faithful to what follows? Whereas when Herbert wrote the book, I feel like the book had a little more of a, I don't know, like they did slightly different things with the ending and with how Paul kind of makes some certain key choices at the end. Right. What did you think about the book versus the movie in that moral dilemma respect?
Yeah, in the end, definitely different than the book. And I kind of wonder how they're going to do Dune Messiah, because the ending of the book is important to where they go in Dune Messiah. So, because I have heard they're going to try to do Dune Messiah as a movie. And it's interesting because having read the book and then seeing the movie ending, I actually like the movie ending better. Because I think Herbert, in his time, he's in the point where men are still in control, women are still lower than, and so he didn't have as much of an issue with the way the book ends, with Chani ending up being his concubine, and
they did Zendaya wrong. They did her wrong.
Yeah. Well, they did it wrong to the book, but I don't think they necessarily did it wrong in the movie, is the thing. So
yeah. So to that point, I was going to ask you a similar question, Peter, because one of the things about it, and I don't know if this is a failure of the movie, because again, I think the movie, I want to make it clear, I think the movie's good, but I do wonder if all I had was the movie in front of me and I didn't do my little Wikipedia deep dives, I didn't talk to people who read the book, would I pick up on this sort of Paul is almost the anti-hero sort of thing? Because we just talked about how you can't view Paul through the hero's journey, but they kind of send us through one, right?
Because a large chunk of it.
In a large chunk of it, basically here's Paul's character arc through Dune 2. Starts off, he's with the Fremen. He doesn't quite know what he's supposed to do. He wants to get revenge on House Harkonnen, but he's not sure if he should do it. His mom, the intergalactic space witch, takes the blue stuff, and now she's like, do it! Friggin' do it! But he doesn't want to, and he's like, no, it's not, I don't want to be their Messiah.
Yeah, right.
But then he goes
and takes Brian there.
I was hearing Seinfeld, but yeah.
But then he goes and takes the spice and drinks the shiny blue stuff, and then he's like, all right, let's do this. Actually, now that my mind's open, being the Messiah seems like a terrific idea. So then he leads the army and he gets violent revenge on all the bad people and takes over with his arsenal of space nukes. And dumps Zendaya for Florence Pugh.
Right.
Did I miss anything like that?
Well, but yeah,
so the arc then is he steps into his destiny, which the movie kind of lets you to believe is a good thing. Even though, it hits the notes of it being a good thing, even though as you're watching, it's like, it seems kind of like what a crazy megalomaniac would do. But also, he's stepping into his destiny, and the shiny blue stuff did tell him to do it, so I don't know.
Well, that's what I think is so interesting about the movie ending. And this is why I want to hear your take as somebody who's thought about it longer, Peter. Because I mean, you get a couple little points where the movie seems like it's having its bump thing in the background, like, ooh, maybe that wasn't a good decision. But in the moment, it looks like a perfectly good decision. And up until he dumps his girlfriend at the very, very end, they give you that.
We see you, Zendaya. We support you.
Yeah, but it feels like the director uses that moment, and almost only that moment, to kind of signal to you, nah, Paul's become something that we're not supposed to like. Because up until that point, what did he do? He raised an army. He fought off the horrible, terrible people that we've seen doing horrible, terrible things the whole time. He killed all the people who were doing horrible, terrible things. He put the emperor in his place. I mean, up until that point, as far as the movie's concerned, it feels kind of like a hero's journey story.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
But then the director sort of gives you that last little, wait a second, precisely by the changes that he makes with Chani's character and how she's treated. Whereas the movie the book is able to do more subtle, more complex things over a lot more time with a lot more data points.
Yeah, I feel like you could watch the movie assuming Paul's the good guy. Like, I feel like that's not an insane takeaway from it. Mm-hmm. Because, like you said, Brian, he gathers the oppressed locals, right? He fights back at, like, the man, which, we do in all movies, right? We have the resistance, blah, 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 blah. He gets vengeance, but on the bad people, and he sort of takes his place as, like, the king of the universe and stuff. Mm-hmm. So you could read it as that, but there's the subtext, right? The stuff that makes you uncomfortable, but it's more implied. Like, you could even be like, well, he dumped Zendaya for Florence Pugh, but he said he still loves Zendaya, and this is a political marriage with Florence Pugh, so whatever. Mm-hmm. So you could have that reading, even though I don't think that's what the director wants us to do. But Peter, you could do this a lot better in a book, right? Because you can sort of get inside Paul's head better. Right. You can see if if his motivations are off, what's going on there. So what's your opinion? Is it clearer in the book?
Oh, well, yeah, it's clearer in the book. I think they could have done more with the revenge aspect of Paul when he becomes Messiah, and then he wants to take revenge on what happened to his family and all that. So, yeah, I definitely think, and I think we said this before, that in a book you can get inside their heads, and there's more you can tell in the story and drive it towards that more negative Paul hero.
And one thing I was thinking about, I think it was partly happenstance. I think I happened to see Dune 2 during Holy Week, but like basically what Paul does for the Fremen, it's basically essentially what the Israelites wanted Jesus to do during Palm Sunday. It's like how they pictured it in his head. It's like, all right, here's our Messiah. He's going to slaughter our enemies and bring in a green paradise. Here we go. It's sort of like Paul's sort of this, it's almost the opposite of Christianity then, right? Because like Paul conquers with power. He takes, it's eye for eye and tooth for tooth. He slaughters the bad guy. Like I think as he's killing the main bad guy, the head of House Harkonnen, he's like, no, you die like a dog, and then just kills him mercilessly. Sorry, Mabel. Mandy and Peter's dog is right here.
She's covering her face.
But yeah, I have no idea what Herbert thought about Christianity or anything, but based on what I've seen, I'm guessing he wasn't observant. No. But it is interesting that it's basically his anti-hero takes this fork in the road where Christianity goes one way, they go the other way, right? It's not take up your cross, it's take up the sword and let's slit some throats. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually I'm thinking about the ending again. I don't think he chose to have Chani like run off as to make Paul negative. I think he was trying to redeem the Chani character from the book. And so instead of her staying and being his concubine, she stands up for herself and leaves. And so I think it's more on that than trying to make Paul the bad guy.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, I felt like that moment of when he suddenly says, "Oh, and princess, hey,
John Boyd. Also, I want to marry your daughter."
That felt like a betrayal moment to him, on his part. That it didn't feel like that in the book. Partly because Chani's played differently, but also partly because it's well established in the book that his mother was a concubine, and that actually there's a fairly equitable arrangement a lot of the time in these families between the person who's nominally the queen and the person who's the concubine but has all the real power, and it's a lot more ambiguous.
Christina, I know you're listening to this. Your husband is not defending the practice of concubinage, okay? He's merely explaining the world building here. But
and I think that's the culture of Herbert back in the 60s that's coming from.
Yeah, and that is interesting because I think, I was mad at Timothée Chalamet for ditching Zendaya. I'll be honest, that was my big takeaway.
Yeah.
But it's almost like the director was trying to walk this tightrope, right? Because they really wanted the character of Zendaya to be a character, right? My understanding is in the book, she's just sort of like, you know, is yeah, okay.
Right.
But whereas they decided to make her a character, which is great. I think she was an effective character throughout the movie. But then we know that he has to marry Florence Pugh, the princess, so that it's hard for him to ditch her in a way that doesn't make him look like a huge jerk. Maybe that's effective. Like you said, Brian, maybe that's a sign like, oh, this dude, maybe there's something up with them. I don't know. Maybe that's a good thing about the movie. There's a lot of ambiguity that you can analyze on a lot of different levels here.
And you could argue that that's a strength, of the book, but certainly the movie. That there's this, you're even through most of part 2, you're watching him make his decisions or thinking about his decisions. You're watching his mother make her decisions, thinking about her decisions. There are different points when they seem in sync and different points where they seem like they might want different things. And I guess I have 2 thoughts on how that plays out. One is it's a more mature story than, say, Star Wars or Lord of the Rings in that particular respect. Not in the sense that the storytelling is more mature, but in the sense of it's trying to do a different thing with its audience. Like Star Wars is essentially it's based on a more of a fairy tale model. It's a children's type of story.
By the book Hero's Journey.
Yeah.
Like literally, that's what George Lucas set out to do.
Yeah, and similarly, Tolkien's trying to essentially create a foundational myth for the English people. There's a lot of sort of children's storytelling elements that they draw from, and this is much more. Okay, you guys are all grown-ups, you've had all that stuff, whatever you think of that stuff, I want you to experience this along with the heroes, and I want you to be looking at what Paul's doing and what his mother's doing and wrestling with yourself as to who's right. And I like that from just as a viewer. That's really interesting to watch play out on screen, and in some ways even more so than it was reading it in the book, because it's quicker and you're processing it quicker along the way. But at the same time, I felt like I was more detached from the characters watching that movie, those movies. It was more, it was a more cerebral enjoyment. It wasn't like, ooh, is Paul going to get hurt in this scene? It wasn't like that kind of excitement that like you have with a lot of these types of movies.
No, exactly. Like, there's no character in the film that we saw that, like, if my kid came up to me and was like, Dad, I want to be like Paul Atreides, he'd be like, oh, no. Right? But I agree there's like this distance from it. There's no one we feel like we're sympathizing with, we're rooting for. There's no one who's like relatable in a sense. Oh, Peter's raising his hand. He has a counterpoint. But Paul is the one who would be, and again, in a typical story, but for all these reasons, he's not, right? He has all these special powers, abilities. He goes down this path of perhaps megalomania at the end. So there's a distance there. Again, the final fight when he's fighting Austin Butler for the universe with their knives, we're rooting. It's not that we're rooting for Paul. We're rooting against this psychopath that he's fighting, right? So there's nobody who I feel like is wholly admirable. But I think Peter may have a counterpoint for it.
I do, and it's because one of your pre-questions was going to be what our favorite character or characters are, and mine would be Duncan Idaho.
That's his real name, by the way, Duncan Idaho.
Yes.
I like to believe name. Frank Hebert just had like a just like flipping through a dictionary, like pointing to okay. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, I'm surprised that the Idaho name would stay for 10,000 years and still be
Frank
there.
Herbert wanted potatoes to matter in the future.
I mean,
and Dunkin'
really,
Donuts, I guess.
If you've ever tried boiled potato, just a little bit of melange on top. oh, it's heaven. Anyway, keep going.
No, so I think that is one of the characters that we can root for and look up to is Duncan, and the way he was loyal and honorable and sacrificial, and dying in the movie to save Paul and Jessica, and but part of my love for Duncan Idaho as a character is that he shows up in all the other books.
Can you explain that? Because he seemed really super dead.
Spoiler alert.
Okay, so let me also tell you, as soon as I watched Dune knowing almost nothing about it, right? But as soon as I see the Duncan Idaho character, first thought, wait, is that really his name? Second thought, this guy has to friggin' die by the end. He's way too useful. You can't have a character this useful do everything for Timothée Chalamet. But okay,
Right.
How does he? What do they do to him?
So it's interesting. They actually clone him. And
There's technology for you.
There is some technology.
That'll make Matt happy.
And
An iPhone's totally forbidden, but we'll clone people. Okay, anyway, keep going.
and that's part of I think one of the themes that he goes into is the philosophy of what makes us who we are. Mm-hmm. And because they clone Duncan, and then Duncan struggles with whether, where his memories are, and he gets his memories back. And so does that make him Duncan Idaho again? And
I'm just spitballing here.
yeah.
If I'm Timothée Chalamet, I would want to clone a whole army of Duncan Idahos.
Yeah.
Is that in the cards?
It was done many years later, and it was done by a different group, kind of like the Bene Gesserits, but it's this other group that knows how to make these clones, and so it wasn't available at the time.
Okay,
So-
okay. I'm just an ideas guy, just
In
trying
the
to help.
books, according to the books.
So Matt wants Duncan Idaho to be the Jango Fett character.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So,
All right.
but there are a lot of reviews that they think Duncan is actually like the main character overall, like because he does show up in all the books,
That's
and
interesting.
there's a character arc kind of thing, and because he's cloned, again, spoiler alert, he's cloned so that they can try to make him kill Paul.
Oh.
Yeah. And so he has that dilemma. He's got these memories that are kind of showing up. He's like, what's going on here? I can't follow this command because I was part of the Atreides family. And
That's kind of fun, actually.
Then it's
Yeah,
like, no,
yeah.
no, you weren't, because you're a clone. And he's
Right.
like, that doesn't help. That makes it even worse.
yeah.
Although I suppose by that logic, if he's the main character, because I mean, does that make Palpatine the main character in Star Wars?
Palpatine's come back somehow.
Right.
Can we go down one slight rabbit hole since we're on this topic? Okay, so you want to know what really bothers me about Star Trek? It's the whole concept of teleporting. Like the beam me up, Scotty.
Right.
It seems obvious to me that being teleported means you die. The you dies, and then an exact copy is made of you at the new location. And nobody knows this because the new you has all your memories, and you just assume the new you assumes it's you, but the old you is actually dead this whole time. So there's probably been 50, 60 versions of Captain Kirk that all get successively killed, but we don't know it because it's the copy of the copy of the copy of the copy of the original. So if they do invent teleportation in the future, don't do it.
I feel certain this must have happened in a Star Trek episode at some point, like two Kirks, because something like that happened.
I mean,
might
they
have been,
what
yeah.
they did?
This
They
sounds really
take all
familiar.
of your
It does.
atoms apart, and then
Right. They put him back together, though.
are those your exact atoms?
That's what they claim.
This is bothering me now. Maybe there's a Doctor Who episode like this. Maybe that's what I'm thinking.
Say no to teleportation.
Okay.
But anyway, we're
That ends up being in the books because Duncan does get cloned more than once.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the arsenal of Matt's skepticism about this story, so far we have things that have bothered Matt: no computers,
yes,
no synthetic drugs,
yes,
and Duncan Idaho's name.
yes.
I feel like we're doing okay, Peter.
Oh.
Yeah.
No. I'd like while we're on the naming thing, the
There's lots of good names.
the Messiah King of the Universe is named
Paul.
Okay.
Maybe
So Paul's name.
maybe
Too simple.
do the second name you came up with, Frank, right? And then the intergalactic space witch is named Jessica. From 20,000 years in the future, we're still naming people Jessica. This This space witch will topple empires. The mighty Jessica.
You have not put a lot of work into your case.
No, but I will say fundamentally, one of the things that I find difficult to really dive into, I can appreciate, like, let me say, the director, Denis Villeneuve, he did a fantastic job, okay? I think a parallel I thought of a little bit ago is this movie kind of is like Alien. Alien, I heard described as a B movie premise with an A+ movie execution, right? So, it's Alien on a spaceship. That's a B movie premise, but it's done in a beautiful way, a thoughtful way. That's why Alien is such a great movie. I love Alien.
Yep.
Dune kind of has all, you could see it as kind of on some level a silly sci-fi book, but it's shot so beautiful. Peter, I said on some level, Peter. I'm not saying that.
Careful.
But it's shot so beautifully. Like, it is really gorgeous.
Yes.
The soundtrack is fantastic. Just
cinematography.
Like, yes, the visual language of the movie is absolutely fantastic. But it's not a world I'd love to spend time in. Arrakis doesn't seem like that cool of a place. I've had enough of sand.
You don't want to wear a bodysuit? Weren't those cool?
You see, as a wise man once said, I hate sand. It's rough and it's coarse and it gets everywhere. Not soft and smooth. And then Natalie Portman kisses him for some reason. Anyway, but yeah, I guess also the movie is so heavy. It's so serious, right? And I'm not saying that is a bad thing. It's just, it's hard for me to want to spend a whole lot of time in this serious sand world where we're all drinking our own urine and talking about how our destinies are controlled. It's just a lot to deal with.
That's what's interesting, I think, about what we were talking about earlier with the hero's journey notion, because it's not like Lord of the Rings where you have, the movie spends 15 minutes or 35 minutes if you're watching the extended version making you love the Shire. Like, oh, this thing is worth fighting for. Right? You're mad at the bad guys because they do a very nice job proving that they're the bad guys. But it's almost more like, Paul's revenge journey. It's more like a Denzel Washington plot premise that just happens to have lots of armies and planets involved.
Yeah, right, and to make it clear, I'm not saying that as a knock against the book.
We're analyzing.
Books can great works can be very heavy. Great works can be in places that aren't pleasant to think about. I'm just explaining why I don't feel compelled to dive deep into the lore unless I'm preparing for a podcast. Right?
Right.
How about you, Peter? Do you like diving into the lore? Can you be like, let's learn about how those sandworms operate?
I thought that part of it is pretty cool, how the interaction of the sand and the worms and the Fremen and the politics of everything. And there are books that have been written by his son in conjunction with another author that I actually met with Mandy at one of the writing conferences. He actually was from Wisconsin. And they do a couple of prequel books that try to build on the lore, and it's based on Frank Herbert's notes. So there's some of that is available out there. But I agree with the movie. It doesn't really come through, like Lord of the Rings gives you at least some background in the beginning of, where did this ring come from and why is it so powerful and all that. So
and the answer to that why should I care question, we should bring Jane Austen into this. We need to bring Jane because Matt and I are on a podcast together. It reminds me of a conversation that Willoughby and Marianne have at Sense and Sensibility about Pope and how they don't really like Pope's poetry because it's more to be admired than loved.
Ooh, that's good. That'll be my thing about Dune. More to be admired than... Yes, thank you. But now, go on, Brian. Go on.
That was it. I think
Oh,
I
there
made
we
my
go.
point.
Mic drop.
Yeah.
But I think I like that because I can admire a lot of the things about Dune. Again, I think some of Herbert's ideas about, leaders, sort of dark side of hero making, just the technical aspects of the film, I do think are excellent. But I can admire it, but I don't love it. I think that'll be my line now.
It was. I mean, it's sitting in the movie theater watching it. It was an incredible thing to watch.
Yes.
And like you said, everything from it's also one of those ones I could imagine myself watching a lot of the behind the scenes featurettes off the Blu-ray later because so much creativity and intentionality went into the costume design, the soundscape. They were talking to Hans Zimmer and saying, "Hey, I don't want this to sound like yet another action adventure movie. I want the music to sound like you're on another planet." And the level of creativity, I mean, gosh, I would just love to pick the director's brain in terms of how did you get, there's so few good movies that are made for a kind of the popcorn flick crowd right now.
Yeah.
How did you get this huge group of people all united around this singular vision so darn beautifully?
And the use of the CGI in a way that you don't go like, oh, it's all just a CGI thing, like what Marvel sort of descended into, and in this stage that's going on right now. It's like, oh, they're all against a green screen. It's all a bunch of cotton candy CGI stuff. This looked good. It was using CGI to further the artwork. And each frame was artistic. The soundtrack fit so well. Again, the technical nuts and bolts movie aspects of this film are outstanding.
And I sense that you were sort of building to your butt. But can I ask you a question? As a writer, how did you feel about the movie specifically? Because Villeneuve has this very intentionally visual approach to his storytelling. I think I even heard him say something like if he could tell a story with no lines at all, he would, because he wants to lean into what you can do with a movie that you could do with no other medium. I'm curious how that way of telling a story rubbed off on you as a writer.
No, I actually like that as, even if I have my writer's hat on, because that's the sort of tools you can use even if you're writing a novel, right? It's not all just, snappy dialogue. That's part of it, but another part of being a writer is knowing when to zoom out, when to speed up, when to slow down. And that can be by description of what the characters are doing, their facial expressions, them walking somewhere. I heard on one review just talking about how there'll be extended scenes of them walking up a mountain and seeing all of their facial expressions really lingering on there. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think he does an outstanding job of that. And you don't often see a big budget film that we're hoping a lot of teenagers are going to see so the film can make money, really doing that, making it a slow burn. I think that's also, I think it's really similar to Alien in that respect too, right? It's this sci-fi concept that it could be you could see it being made as a silly movie, but they take it seriously. They really let the tension build. They let you linger with everything. I think overall that part of the movie was extremely effective.
Yeah, I'm a visual learner, and so seeing a movie like that and remembering what I visualized when I was reading the books, and then seeing the movie kind of being what I imagined.
Yeah,
that I thought was cool, because that shows the director must have had some sort of passion for what was written to want to be it that way,
Can you say a little more about that? Because usually, I mean, you go the furthest back with this story of the three of us.
Yeah.
And usually, in my experience, when I see a movie of a book that was special to me as a kid or a teenager, sometimes there are elements of it that go, oh, that's more or less how I imagined it. That's so cool seeing it on a screen. But a lot of the time it's, oh, it's not how I imagined that character. It's not how I imagined this. It's not how I imagined that. And there's almost that disenchantment. You have to separate yourself. I think Junius Johnson said this at some point on one of our shows. There's the story, and there's a book version of a story, and there's a movie version of a story. and you can't think of it as a movie being made of a book. It's a movie being made of a story, and they're doing different things. But yeah, but as like it meant a lot to you, and you were seeing it on the screen, going, "Oh, this is just how I imagined it."
Yeah, I was, and
Wow.
and I think that helps. I think that is a testament to Frank Herbert in the way he could describe things, and that you could see what he was writing about.
Mm-hmm.
And I get the same thing with Stephen King. The way he describes things, it's like you're there, and you're seeing it happen, kind of.
Yeah, we talked about the slow burn aspect of the movie, like lingering on the visuals. Do you get the feeling like the book's doing the same thing in that medium?
Say again?
Yeah, it's just sort of taking time, setting the scene, letting the tension build, all that stuff.
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah.
In a really different way.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are running low on time, so final set of questions now. So listen, for the listeners here, let's have two groups of listeners here. The first group, let's say they're coming in cold, right? They're going along with me like, spoilers, whatever. And they want to dive into the world of Dune. You know, they want to hop on that sandworm and go riding across the deserts of Arrakis, right? So what would you recommend? Would you recommend starting with the book, starting with the movie, do what I did and read Wikipedia on the lore of Dune before watching the movie? What do you think the best approach is for that, Brian?
I'd rather go second, actually. I defer to your superior experience with the story.
That's a good question. I think maybe the reading up on the lore, or maybe a summary of the background, would help with somebody.
I will say that
wants
helped me
to
a
just
lot.
Watch the movies.
Oh, that's a Bene Gesserit. Okay.
Yeah. Because I can't remember if it was Bethany that said she watched the first one and she was really confused, and I was like, I wish I was there. I could explain some things, as we're watching. But she loved the second one. After
Because you got your context at that point.
Yeah. Well, also the first one's kind of a weird. First of all, it's basically like the setup to the real movie, which is part 2.
Right. It's 80% world building, which is interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting they got away with that.
Yeah, a lot of it's them like wandering through an empty palace, and but yeah, it really gets going in book 2.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Okay, so now final question is, where do you hope this goes next? From what I hear, around the nerdosphere, the book that they would base movie 3 on, Dune Messiah, is kind of weird and not the best.
Correct.
Would you like them to just adapt it anyway, because that's what happens? Do you want Villeneuve to sort of go off script? What are you hoping for?
I do agree that the second book was not as good as the first, and the third book, Children of Dune, is better. And so if there is a way maybe that they can get there quickly and just do this third movie based on the third book, Children of Dune.
I could be wrong, but I thought that was what I heard they were doing, that the third movie would be a pretty heavily adapted story that incorporated elements of books 2 and 3. I could be making that up, but that rings a bell.
Yeah.
Because I remember thinking, that would make sense given where it goes.
Yeah.
Also, I didn't get to answer
the
first question, Matt. Which is, like, I just think Dune is it's the sort of thing you either like or you don't. But if you're into the world building stuff, if you're into political intrigue stories, if you're into that sort of end of storytelling, I would actually start with the book. Because the movie gives you lots of spectacle and it's just gorgeous. Like, I'm sure they will be showing these movies in film school for a very long time. But the book, I cared more about what was happening, and there were just a lot of scenes where it was like my mind was just racing to catch up with the level of social complexity of what was going on between several different characters as they were saying one thing and meaning another to try to manipulate this other person at the other end of the table. And, there's just a lot more of that kind of literary level of multi-layered interest to me.
Yeah, I agree.
And also, word to the wise, if you are going to read the book, I love books on tape. Most of the books I go through on audiobooks. Do not do the audiobook of Dune. You'll have no idea what's going on.
But you know how to pronounce everything.
Yeah,
but I don't know what they are. It's all these lines of like, what the Benny, whatchamacallit?
But as you think about this, folks, remember, if you're thinking about reading this book or watching this movie, don't forget Matt's ironclad case against it. There are no computers. There are no synthetic drugs. Duncan, Idaho has a bad name. Paul has a bad name. And the kicker, Jessica has a bad name.
I stand by all my points. Also, they do Zendaya wrong. And no, that's the full list. That's it. All right. So, with all that said, folks, as you can probably tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire's down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've already finished off your final bag of melange. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have a few extra seconds, your mind's been expanded by the melange and you're feeling generous, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.